Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos that I'm doing about resources in games, and we're focusing on money systems in games, and in this video I'm going to talk about in-game economies. As part of a wider series or suite of videos that I'm doing about game design issues and how to design certain aspects of games, which in turn is part of my channel and game development stuff. So, the previous videos in this series have talked about various things to do with resources. I will refer to some of the concepts from them, but don't worry, you probably can watch this as a standalone. So the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that game economies are unreal. They're not like the real world in that money just appears and disappears. And as a game designer, you control this process. And I've talked about these terms several times in the previous videos in this series about sources and sinks. So if you're just dropping in onto this video, sources are places where I guess you can look at it in two ways, either as the player character, so sources of money is how they gain money, and sinks is how they spend money, or how money disappears from them. But also sometimes, and we'll be looking at this later in this video, you need to view your economy for your game as a whole in terms of sources and sinks, because once you start having an economy with transactions in where the money's persistent, then this becomes a thing. However, the important thing is that in the simple situation, you are totally under control as to what's happening with the game economy and the kind of feel of whether the game has any kind of economy to it. Players tend to get richer as they play through the game, and why not? This is one of those feeling of advancement things. I then immediately start thinking, well, what would it be like to have a game in which the player starts rich and slowly gets poorer? And I guess you'd have to have a good reason for doing that and use that well for it to be a legitimate thing that would actually attract players and for players to enjoy it. And I think there are possibilities for that, but let's not get too distracted. Some games, that really is the focus, is the player getting richer. This is Adventure Capitalist, is a game that's sometimes called an idle game or a clicker game. It's one of the best of the genre, in my opinion, that's out there. I quite like these kind of games, and the whole point of this is to spend money to get resources that then create money over time, and it just ramps way up out of all proportion. And it's fun because it's done on purpose. Okay. Sometimes in a game you want to simulate real economies, and you might want to do this for a feel of realism. You might want to do it for all sorts of other reasons, but the most common reason for wanting to do this is if you have trading elements in your game, and then you want your players to be subject to variations in the economy. So if you've got any form of trading going on in the game, you almost certainly want some kind of price variation happening. The simplest of this is to have localized variations in prices. And I guess one of the most typical trading types of game is space trading. And so you have the concept potentially of some planets that have a higher demand for some goods and sell some goods cheaper. And as a trader, you're responsible for trying to move stuff around and make a profit in the process. And That's not going to work if there's no variation in prices between different places. There may be random variations in prices, so either as a global thing or if you've got localized prices, there might be variations in those prices. And it's possible to simulate the idea of a fluctuating economy without doing anything more complicated than just putting some time-based random variation going on. And you could make that um, small variation, or you can make that big and wild variation if you wanted to. It depends on what you want to achieve with your game. As always is the case with anything that has randomness attached to it, players will almost certainly come up with all sorts of fantastic theories about the patterns that evolve out of that, because players do. Um, you could build in a bit more sophisticatedly some kind of concept of supply and demand. So you could make it so that you you have the concept of demand for something that is uh, yeah, part of your economy, and then as the player moves stuff about, then the supply changes depending on where they move it to. You could also have simulate the NPC traders doing the same thing, so you could have it even more dynamic by doing that. You could have persistent goods. So some games do this. Even uh, even a kind of RPG fantasy game might have the concept of you sell a sword to a vendor, and that vendor has still got that sword when you come back later, and you can start getting deeper and deeper into this with real good production. The idea of pumping goods into the economy, the idea of taking goods out of the economy by people using them, and this starts to get more complicated as you go further down these lines. So the kind of extreme for this is to go down the route to start thinking about real modelling of an economy, um, and I'm going to say that I'm unaware of games that have done this strongly. Um, but it is a tactic that you could think about. I think there are issues with it. I think there are reasons why people don't do it. So quickly, kind of running through what that might mean. Persistent goods, which we've already talked about. The idea of persistent money, AI NPCs, which are who are buying stuff and selling stuff and creating worth for the economy. Um, the I think the issues with this is that control is an interesting thing because uh, it there is a possibility of it getting out of control. Particularly if rampant inflation is a thing that can happen. And there may be exploits, so there may be ways that the players can manipulate this to their own ends. Of course, you may want to create a game precisely for this point to see, um, to enable players to do this sort of things. And so it wasn't Economy, but Universe Sandbox is a game that kind of basically does this. It says we're gonna simulate what could happen in a real universe to a certain level of detail, and then allow the player to play with it. You could do that with an economy game. It might be quite interesting. Anyway, there are dangers with that, I think. So let's move on. Multiplayer games uh, can have particular issues or particular things that you need to deal with in terms of economies, especially and possibly only if you have any kind of player-to-player transactions. So any ways in which goods and or money can change hands between players, you suddenly open up a whole lot of stuff. So I'm going to mention here the classic example of this is World of Warcraft has an auction house. And this allows players to buy and sell goods that they've made or they've found in world drops or in some cases even got from quest rewards that tends to be limited. There are limitations on what can be bought and sold, quite sensibly. Um, but this opens up a whole load of things that can happen as once you start getting these kind of transactions possible. So you have to remember that in games, as I said at the beginning of this video, money appears from nowhere. Um, Now, in the real world, it is possible for money to appear from nowhere, but it needs to be limited, which is why this thing called quantitative easing that you might have heard of is usually not done in to large extents, only kind of small amounts at a time and trickling in, because money appearing from nowhere can give you a problem. Um, because then in the real world, obviously, but also in these kind of multiplayer games, the money then starts to circulate as well. So once you get transactions of goods, and as well as the money appearing from nowhere, the goods appear from nowhere as well, conceptually. So you have this thing that's circulating around, and so if you're not careful, this does tend towards the real world thing of inflation, and you can get in-game inflation. So you need to keep an eye on economies of any games that that have this sort of thing. You need to keep an eye on them and build in ways of controlling this if you're going to need to. However, the most useful thing is sinks. Once again, I'm talking about sources and sinks. I keep talking about them because they're so important in terms of designing resources in games and money, and especially. And if you provide sinks, ways for the players to spend money, and particularly this is ways for the players to spend money that does not give them something of in return, which they can exchange back for money again. So things like consumables, potions are consumables, they're great. And things like paying for fast travel, paying for learning recipes for your crafting and stuff like that are all sinks in your multiplayer games. But also, a significant sink in these systems is players that leave. So any kind of in-game economy that is starting to have this circulation, one of your major sinks is the players who stop playing because they accumulate money on their effectively on their character, and then when they stop, that money disappears from the game and from the game economy. Once you get things like this, you do open up the world for market manipulation. There's all sorts of things that can happen and do happen in the World of Warcraft market. Things like cornering the market and uh, people doing price fixing, price hiking, all sorts of things that can go on. And I guess there's the question as a designer is, do you mind? Is there a problem with this or not? Even I think games that are relatively simple, and this is the Miniclip's 8-Ball Pool game, which has a form of transaction between players, which is that when two players play against each other, they both put in some money, and the winner takes the pot. And this means that money is being transferred between players. And when I look at the game, and like I say, and I might do a video sometime down the line, specifically about the economy in 8-Ball Pool, because it's very interesting. I'm sure they have thought about sources and sinks because it works, and you don't get kind of rampant stuff going on. One of the things that does control it is that the pots of money are fixed amounts. You can choose which one you're going into depending on how much money you've got. So there is choice, but they are specific amounts, and so the players have no control over making that hike up. There is something needing to be said about when game resources are worth real money. So this is a weird thing, or when you start to look at it, it seems weird. The fact that things in games can change hands for real money. And this can be things like game accounts, so where somebody has spent a lot of time building up a character and skilling them up and then sells the account on to another player. It can be things like gold farming, which certainly was a thing in World of Warcraft in years gone by. I don't know if it still is a thing. There have been games. There was, well, it wasn't really a game, but a thing called Second Life, where it was built in as part of the thing that players could make things and then sell them to other players using a currency that could be bought with real money, and so it was effectively worth real money. And when you first encounter this, um, this seems like a crazy thing that anybody would actually pay real money for something that's just virtual. But in some ways, it's not different from paying money for a painting or paying money to listen to some music or all sorts of other ephemeral things that people do pay money for. Um, and it's all about the concept of worth. And later on in this series, I'm going to do a video specifically about the concept of worth. So there's a question that I like to pose to students about gold farming, which is, so if you're in a situation where you've got gold farming in an MMO, and there are people who are grinding away at these games and then selling the money that they create to other players for real world money. Why do the creators of the game not get rid of this by undercutting the gold farmers? Because they don't need to grind to create this money. They can just change a number in a database somewhere, and that creates the money out of nowhere. And the answer is because um, invariably that would lead to all sorts of other problems, in particular hyperinflation. And it's the same effectively as in a real world situation, a government deciding they're going to print a whole lot more money and inject it into the economy. And um, experience and history has shown that this tends to lead to inflationary problems if you do this too much. Okay. And then I guess the other side of um, that issue is once you've got in-game resources that are worth real money, you then have a problem of well, so two problems of integrity and security, which is that you need to make sure that you've got no bugs in your game where things are made out of nowhere without any effort going into it. So any exploits that create things out of nowhere. I heard a tale, I can't remember what the game is, where there was one of the early massively multiplayer games where somebody found a way of cloning objects in the game by doing things with clever things with the inventory, and was managing to sell these objects for real world money and had made about $40,000 before the game company closed this loop. It's crazy stuff. Um, Security for accounts obviously then becomes a huge factor because if a player's resources are worth real money, then it's then open to theft. And there's I guess, a question of do you trust your designers? Because the easy way to make money out of this is to be a designer who's able just to say, right, okay, I've got these things, and change some information somewhere, again in a database, and then sneak off, make their own kind of private account, and sell this stuff off. So you've got to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen as well. So it can happen, um, and it's a nightmare. So there are all sorts of problems surrounding this. You might think that it's a great thing for a game when your game resources are worth real money, and I guess it kind of shows popularity for your game, but there are all sorts of problems that come along with it. Okay. Microtransactions, I just want to mention because having talked about the idea that externally to the company who makes the game, um, things in game could be worth real money. Microtransactions deliberately does this and makes things in game buyable with real money usually. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on exploring microtransactions, the ins and outs, and the good practice, bad practice, etc. There's all sorts of things that could be said here. What I do want to say at this point is that some games that use microtransactions go down what I think is a very sensible route of having two currencies. And you may have played these games and seen them. So you have one currency, which is the kind of main currency that you use for the gameplay, and you have a second currency with which you can buy whatever it is you're going to allow microtransactions to have. Sometimes it's just cosmetic things, and never underestimate the attraction of cosmetic stuff in games. But it's certainly one way of keeping your real world transactions separate from your game economy. And some games don't do that. There are games that manage to sell money in their main currency quite successfully and not break the game. So that's fine. But I just wanted to mention this. Okay, so it keeps things separate. Right, so that's been kind of a random, maybe. It's certainly a bit of me waffling, talking along about game economies, all the way from the very simple stuff towards some more complicated stuff at the far end. And that's it from me for now.